Simon Cowell was known for control, calm judgment, and steady decisions. For decades, very little on live television caused visible cracks in that image. But during one public moment tied to Courtney Hadwin, the timeline shifted. His reaction did not match the setting. His silence lasted longer than expected. The details around that moment were unclear. The events before and after did not line up in a simple way. Viewers noticed hesitation, changes in tone, and sudden gaps in explanation. What followed was not fully addressed. And from that point forward, several details stopped making sense. For decades, Simon Cowell built a public role based on control, restraint, and steady judgment. His career developed across long seasons of televised competitions, public interviews, and high-pressure live broadcasts. Through each stage, his behavior followed a consistent pattern. His posture remained firm. His voice stayed measured. His reactions followed a predictable rhythm. Viewers learned what to expect from him. He evaluated talent using brief comments, direct language, and careful pacing. Even when performers struggled or tension rose, his response rarely shifted. This steady presence became part of his professional identity. Producers relied on his consistency. Contestants prepared for his clear, focused feedback. Audiences recognized his tone and timing. Over years of repeated appearances, this pattern created a stable public image. He was seen as a figure who managed pressure without visible strain. His judgment carried weight because it followed logic and routine. Emotional reactions were rare and brief. When they did appear, they were controlled and quickly contained. Across interviews and live broadcasts, this restraint remained unchanged. His commentary stayed short. His expressions stayed limited. His decisions followed structured thinking. Each season added more examples of the same approach. As the years passed, this predictability shaped public expectations. Any deviation from that pattern became noticeable. Even small changes stood out against the long record of steady behavior. This history formed a clear baseline. When a contestant stepped onto the stage, the exchange followed a familiar order. Performance ended. Cowell paused briefly. He spoke in calm, direct terms. His feedback focused on clarity, skill, and audience impact. Rarely did personal emotion enter the exchange. This rhythm remained constant through thousands of televised moments. When Courtney Hadwin first appeared in competition, this established pattern remained intact. Early interactions followed the same structure. Cowell evaluated her performances using his usual tone. His posture, pacing, and delivery matched his long-standing approach. His remarks focused on technical quality and stage presence. No unusual reactions appeared. No visible tension entered the exchange. The sequence of events remained predictable. During these early stages, there were no signs of emotional deviation. The rhythm of judging stayed consistent. Cowell's body language reflected his standard posture. His pauses followed familiar timing. His words stayed brief and precise. From the outside, nothing in these early moments suggested an upcoming change. This consistency reinforced the public understanding of his role. Viewers continued to expect calm control. Producers continued to rely on predictable responses. Contestants prepared for structured critique. The entire environment operated within a well-established framework. Because of this long pattern, even slight disruptions would later become noticeable. Any shift in tone, timing, or expression stood apart from years of repetition. When a moment arrived that did not follow this structure, it immediately drew attention. The contrast between past behavior and present reaction became difficult to ignore. For years, his professional record showed stability. His public presence remained measured. His reactions stayed controlled. His authority rested on consistency. Yet despite this long history, a later moment introduced a visible change. That single instance did not match the pattern built over decades, creating a break in the timeline that raised questions which would not be easily resolved. Courtney Hadwin entered the public stage with little prior exposure. Before her appearance, she had limited recognition outside small performance circles. When she stepped onto the competition platform, the initial response centered on contrast. Her quiet entrance and reserved posture created one set of expectations. Her performance immediately disrupted those assumptions. The shift between her initial presentation and her delivery drew attention from both judges and viewers. This early reaction led to rapid public interest. Media coverage increased within days. Online discussion expanded quickly. Short clips of her performances circulated across platforms. Interviews followed. Each appearance added to her growing visibility. The pace of this rise was faster than typical for contestants at similar stages. As she advanced, production schedules tightened. Rehearsal hours increased. Travel demands grew. Public appearances expanded. These changes created a more demanding routine. Yet, during this period, on-screen interactions between Courtney and Simon Cowell remained structured and consistent. His commentary stayed focused on performance quality. He spoke about timing, control, and audience connection. His tone matched his usual pattern. No visible emotional deviation appeared. Each judging segment followed the established sequence. Performance concluded. Brief pause. Direct feedback. Limited expression. The rhythm remained unchanged. Even as Courtney's popularity grew, the exchanges stayed formal and professional. The timeline showed no disruption. Behind the scenes, production demands increased. Rehearsal sessions became longer. Media scheduling grew denser. Travel requirements expanded. These adjustments placed greater pressure on contestants. However, official coverage focused on performance outcomes rather than operational changes. Public interviews highlighted talent growth and competition progress. Throughout this period, Courtney's schedule showed signs of acceleration. Appearances became more frequent. Media requests increased. Coordination between production teams tightened. Each new appearance added layers of responsibility. Despite this, official communication remained limited to performance commentary. Cowell's behavior continued to reflect his established style. He maintained brief remarks. His posture remained firm. His delivery stayed controlled. There were no visible signs of strain. The public record showed steady professional conduct. As Courtney advanced through competition stages, attention intensified. Audience engagement rose. Media coverage expanded. Yet the tone of official commentary remained unchanged. Judges maintained formal evaluation. No personal narrative emerged. The focus stayed on technical growth and stage development. This phase of rapid ascent created a dense timeline. Events moved quickly. Performances followed in close succession. Media appearances overlapped. Rehearsals extended into longer hours. Despite this acceleration, the outward presentation stayed stable. However, the increased pace introduced new operational demands. Production adjustments became necessary. Scheduling required tighter coordination. Movement between venues became more frequent. These logistical changes were visible through patterns of appearance and travel. Still, none of these shifts explained any later deviations. At this stage, the timeline showed continuity. Courtney's rise progressed without public disruption. Cowell's behavior remained aligned with his long-standing reputation. The environment appeared controlled. Yet, as the workload expanded, the effects of sustained pressure remained unclear. The visible sequence did not fully explain how these changes influenced later events. As her profile continued to rise, the underlying impact of this intensified schedule remained unaddressed, leaving unanswered questions about how these conditions shaped what followed. During one live broadcast connected to Courtney Hadwin's performance, the usual rhythm of judging changed. Viewers who had followed Simon Cowell's work for years noticed the shift almost immediately. His posture appeared more rigid than usual. His facial expression remained fixed. The brief pause that normally came before his remarks stretched longer than expected. The camera held its focus, waiting for a response that did not arrive on schedule. When he finally spoke, his words were limited. The tone remained calm, but the delivery felt restrained. The familiar pattern of short, direct critique did not fully unfold. Instead, the exchange ended quickly, leaving a noticeable gap in the flow of the segment. Other judges continued with their standard commentary, but Cowell's part remained unusually brief. This moment stood out because it disrupted a long-standing structure. For years, his reactions followed consistent pacing. Even when performances surprised him, his response remained controlled and predictable. In this case, the delay and limited speech created a visible pause in the timeline. The broadcast moved forward without explanation, leaving the moment unresolved. Viewers later replayed the segment, noting the extended silence and subtle changes in expression. Online discussion focused on the unusual pacing. Short clips circulated, isolating the moment. Yet official broadcast edits did not provide clarification. No technical difficulties were reported. The production continued as scheduled, without acknowledgement of any disruption. Following the episode, interviews and press materials avoided reference to the incident. Commentary centered on competition progress rather than backstage conditions. Statements remained general. No formal explanation addressed the pause or the change in behavior. The absence of detail left the event isolated in the public record. Within the structure of live television, such deviations are rare. Timing is carefully managed. Responses are rehearsed in format, if not in content. Deviations from this structure typically result from technical issues, unexpected developments, or personal reactions. In this case, no technical explanation emerged. No production statement followed. The broadcast archive contained only the visible moment, without added context. As subsequent episodes aired, Cowell's demeanor shifted subtly. His remarks stayed brief. His pauses became more noticeable. His interactions with Courtney remained formal, yet slightly restrained. The tone did not return fully to its earlier rhythm. This change persisted across multiple broadcasts. The timeline suggested a turning point. Before the broadcast, his conduct remained consistent with decades of behavior. Afterward, a different pattern appeared. While not dramatic, the shift was sustained. It became part of the ongoing sequence. Despite public interest, no detailed account explained what had occurred during that brief on-screen pause. No backstage footage clarified the moment. No direct statement connected the reaction to specific circumstances. The incident remained isolated, suspended between established history and unexplained change. Within the larger sequence, this moment served as a dividing line. Events before it followed predictable structure. Events after it showed subtle alteration. The contrast created uncertainty, raising questions about what might have occurred outside the visible frame. The cause of this reaction remained unclear. Without confirmation, the moment stood as an interruption in a long, stable timeline, marking a point where established patterns no longer fully explained observed behavior. After the broadcast moment, small changes began to appear within the production process. These adjustments were not announced and did not receive formal explanation. However, patterns in scheduling, media access, and rehearsal flow suggested that internal procedures had shifted. The timeline following the episode showed a gradual tightening of control around Courtney Hadwin's appearances. Rehearsal schedules became more structured. Time blocks appeared shorter, yet more frequent. Movement between rehearsal spaces and performance areas followed stricter timing. Staff coordination increased. Access to backstage areas became more limited. These adjustments created a more controlled environment, though no official reason was provided. Media access also changed. Interviews became shorter and more selective. Press interactions followed tighter formats. Questions focused almost entirely on performance rather than behind-the-scenes conditions. Public appearances outside scheduled broadcasts decreased. When Courtney did appear in interviews, responses stayed brief and carefully framed. The tone remained professional, but the scope narrowed. Production logistics showed similar restraint. Travel arrangements appeared more structured. Movement between venues involved smaller teams. Scheduling gaps that previously allowed informal interaction were reduced. These changes suggested a focus on efficiency and containment, though no direct explanation accompanied the shift. At the same time, Simon Cowell's on-screen behavior reflected subtle adjustments. His commentary remained concise. His posture stayed firm. Yet his engagement level shifted. Exchanges became more formal. Extended remarks were rare. Pauses appeared more deliberate. The overall rhythm of his judging segments became tighter, with less variation. These changes did not appear isolated. Across several episodes, the same patterns repeated. Rehearsal access remained limited. Media interactions stayed controlled. On-screen exchanges continued in a restrained format. The consistency of these adjustments suggested a coordinated response rather than random fluctuation. Despite these visible shifts, official communication remained unchanged. Press materials continued to focus on competition results. Production announcements emphasized performance quality and audience engagement. No statements addressed backstage changes. No interviews clarified operational adjustments. The timeline contained visible movement without recorded explanation. Within production environments, such coordinated shifts often follow internal assessments. These can relate to scheduling demands, workload management, or logistical efficiency. In this case, however, the timing of the adjustments placed them directly after the unexplained broadcast moment. The proximity of these events created a visible sequence, even in the absence of formal commentary. As weeks passed, the modified structure remained in place. Courtney's appearances followed the same controlled pattern. Cowell's on-screen demeanor maintained its restrained tone. The production process continued under these adjusted conditions. The result was a stable yet altered operational environment. Everything functioned smoothly but differently. The visible process no longer matched the earlier stages of the competition. The transition occurred quietly, without announcement, and remained in effect. This sequence raised a central question. While the changes themselves were subtle, their timing and consistency suggested purpose. Yet, without explanation, the underlying cause remained uncertain. The coordinated shift in production flow stood as another gap in the timeline, adding to the growing pattern of unanswered details surrounding the original on-air moment. Following the public reaction to the unusual broadcast moment, official statements began to appear. These comments followed familiar patterns. They emphasized talent development, performance quality, and the positive direction of the competition. They avoided reference to the earlier pause or any change in on-screen behavior. Press releases remained brief and general. Interviews stayed focused on results, training, and upcoming performances. Media coverage followed a similar path. Articles highlighted Courtney Hadwin's progress, her stage presence, and audience response. Headlines centered on competition outcomes rather than backstage developments. Broadcast recaps summarized performances and judge reactions without drawing attention to the earlier shift. The moment that had drawn public curiosity did not become part of the official narrative. When questions surfaced online, responses remained limited. Public-facing communication stayed carefully framed. There were no extended explanations, no detailed clarifications. The absence of direct acknowledgement created a noticeable gap between viewer interest and official commentary. Television edits also reflected this approach. Replay segments did not revisit the moment. Promotional clips focused on performance highlights. Interviews with judges followed established talking points. Even when Cowell appeared in separate media settings, his comments remained centered on the competition as a whole. The timeline moved forward without addressing what had occurred. This pattern of silence extended across multiple weeks. As new episodes aired, attention gradually shifted toward emerging contestants and advancing rounds. Public discussion of the earlier moment slowly declined. Yet the lack of explanation remained part of the record. Archived footage preserved the original segment. Viewers continued to analyze the timing, the expressions, and the pacing. Small details became points of focus. However, without official context, these observations remained disconnected from confirmed facts. In media environments, unusual broadcast moments often prompt follow-up. Clarifications may address technical issues, production delays, or unforeseen disruptions. In this case, none of these explanations appeared. No technical faults were cited. No scheduling conflicts were acknowledged. No personal statements clarified the pause. This silence created a contrast. On one side stood a visible deviation from established behavior. On the other stood a controlled public narrative that did not account for it. The gap between these two elements remained unresolved. As competition coverage continued, the story followed a familiar arc of performance and progression. Yet the earlier incident stayed isolated. It existed within the timeline but without narrative connection. This separation prevented a complete reconstruction of events. Over time, official materials maintained consistent language. They highlighted discipline, growth, and opportunity. They avoided discussion of tension or disruption. This uniform approach suggested deliberate framing. The absence of direct reference became part of the broader pattern. Within the documented sequence, the original moment remained without context. It stood between established behavior and later procedural changes, forming a visible break. The lack of explanation preserved uncertainty. Even as public focus shifted, the missing details continued to define the timeline. The unanswered questions did not disappear. They simply moved into the background, embedded within the larger narrative of competition and performance. The result was a sequence marked by omission. A visible event occurred. Operational adjustments followed. Official communication remained general. Together, these elements created a timeline with a central gap. The absence of direct explanation sustained uncertainty, leaving the original reaction without a clear place in the documented record.